A single scroll could travel 1,000 years. The great libraries of the ancient world were not silent tombs for books, but beating hearts in a vast, living network. This hidden web of knowledge connected continents and centuries, ensuring that the ideas of one civilization could spark a revolution in another. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the invisible architecture of history itself, seeing how every book you read and every fact you know exists because of this ancient, resilient system. How did a Greek medical text survive the collapse of Rome to heal patients in medieval Paris? What secret role did traveling merchants and quiet monks play in saving philosophy from oblivion? The answers reveal a story of incredible human ingenuity. Are you ready to trace the path of an idea across 2,000 years? Alexandria's harbor was a symphony of languages and cargo. Here, the royal decree of the Ptolemies functioned like an ancient algorithm for data collection. Every ship that docked, whether from Athens, Babylon, or the Indus Valley, was met by library officials. They did not seize the scrolls traders carried, but they borrowed them, paying a deposit. Scribes then worked in shifts, copying every word by hand before returning the original to its owner. This systematic, almost industrial process turned the library into a cosmic crossroads, a repository where Babylonian star charts could sit beside Greek plays and Egyptian medical papyri. It was the first great experiment in centralized knowledge, proving that bringing diverse ideas into one physical space created something greater than the sum of its parts. Think of it not as a quiet study hall, but as a vibrant, noisy think tank. Within its halls, Euclid organized the principles of geometry into a logical system that would teach the world how to reason. Eratosthenes, using reports from travelers and simple observations of shadows, calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy. These breakthroughs were possible because the raw materials of global thought were all under one roof. But the library's genius had a second, quieter layer. It was not a vault meant to hoard. Scholars constantly arrived, studied, and departed, carrying copies of texts or their own compiled summaries. These copies became the seeds. A geometry text copied in Alexandria might be studied in a library in Antioch, then recopied for a collection in Rome. So when we speak of the library's tragic loss, we must remember its true legacy was not in the parchment that burned, but in the ideas that had already escaped, carried on 1,000 ships to countless other shores. The model was set. Knowledge, once concentrated, could be deliberately scattered, creating a network resilient to the loss of any single node. But the survival of an idea requires more than a single safe harbor. The scrolls that left Alexandria needed a new home, a place where they would not just be stored but actively revived. That home was built not by a pharaoh but by a caliph in a city that was the new crossroads of the world. In Baghdad, under the Abbasid dynasty, a different kind of intellectual engine was constructed. The House of Wisdom was founded with a deliberate and transformative mission. Its core function was not just collection, but translation. This was the critical evolution in the network. Think of Alexandria as a grand central station where knowledge from every route was gathered. Baghdad became the powerhouse where that knowledge was converted into a new fuel, a common language that could power innovation across an entire civilization. The caliphs funded what historians call the translation movement, a state-sponsored project of staggering ambition. Teams of scholars, often working in collaborative houses, were tasked with a single purpose: to render the great works of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac thought into Arabic. This was not a passive act of copying. It was an active, creative process of synthesis. A Greek medical text by Galen would be translated, but then an Islamic physician like Al-Razi would annotate it, challenge its conclusions, and add his own observations from clinical practice. The text evolved, it grew. Ptolemy's star catalogue, the Almagest, was translated and then refined by astronomers using more advanced instruments in Baghdad's observatories. Perhaps the most famous example is the story of a word. A Persian mathematician named Al-Khwarizmi studied Indian texts on problem solving. In his seminal work, he described a method of balancing equations he called algebra. This word, entering Latin centuries later, became algebra. The algorithm is named for Al-Khwarizmi himself. This is the genius of the House of Wisdom model. It did not treat ancient knowledge as sacred and untouchable. It treated it as a foundation, a set of building blocks to be rearranged, improved upon, and built higher. By translating into Arabic, the scholarly language of a vast empire, they created a resilient, decentralized network. Copies of these enhanced texts did not stay in one library. They traveled along trade routes and pilgrimage paths to new hubs of learning in Cairo, Damascus, and all the way to Cordoba in Islamic Spain. So when political change later came to Baghdad, and the House of Wisdom itself faded from prominence, the knowledge it had processed did not vanish. It had already been multiplied and scattered, saved by the very network it helped to create. The classical learning of Greece and Rome, now fused with discoveries from Persia and India, was preserved in a new linguistic vessel. This vessel would prove crucial, for it was about to make a perilous journey across a final, unexpected bridge. The Great Translation movement in Baghdad created a new linguistic vessel for knowledge, but the vessel still needed to cross a turbulent sea. As political landscapes shifted, the survival of these texts depended on finding a new kind of sanctuary, one not built on imperial ambition but on spiritual devotion. The classical world's final, most unlikely guardians would be men sworn to poverty, silence, and prayer. In the cold, stone cloisters of European monasteries, the frantic pace of Alexandria and Baghdad gave way to a different tempo, the slow, patient rhythm of the scriptorium. Here, in rooms lit by tallow candles and quiet but for the scratch of a quill, the network of knowledge did not die. It went underground, transforming into something more resilient than any library made of marble. A monk's entire life could be dedicated to this single, sacred task. His world was the parchment on his desk, a page of Virgil's poetry or a volume of Pliny's natural history that had made its long, improbable journey from a Middle Eastern translation house to this remote European valley. He was not merely a copyist, he was a human hard drive, painstakingly rewriting every character to create a new, identical copy. This was preservation as a spiritual act, a form of devotion that believed saving a text on geometry or medicine was a way of honoring the divine order inherent in creation. Each monastery, from Monte Cassino in Italy to St. Gall in the Alps, became a self-contained node in this new, decentralized network. They were connected not by royal decree, but by the quiet traffic of the faithful. Traveling monks carried news and books along pilgrimage routes. An abbot might send a precious volume as a gift to a sister house, a loan that was often never returned, effectively planting a seed copy in a new location. This informal, organic system of exchange created something brilliant, a distributed backup. A fire might destroy the library at one monastery, but the same text existed in a dozen others, scattered across the continent. The work was agonizingly slow, a lifetime to produce perhaps a few dozen books, but this very slowness was its strength. It created not one copy, but many, each one a new chance for survival. It is here, in these silent scriptoria, that we find the unbroken thread. The so-called Dark Ages in Western Europe were not a period of intellectual darkness, but of patient, careful stewardship. The light was not extinguished, it was banked, burning low and steady in 100 isolated hearths, waiting for the moment when the world would be ready to fan it back into a flame. That moment would come when this quiet, monastic network intersected with a powerful new force, one that could replicate a book not in a year, but in a day. The monastic Scriptoria kept the embers glowing, but it took a new kind of furnace to turn those embers into a blaze. That furnace was lit in the cities of Al-Andalus, in the dazzling libraries of Cordoba, and the collaborative workshops of Toledo. Here, the network of knowledge did more than just preserve. It accelerated, synthesizing streams of thought from across the known world into a powerful new current. The Library of Cordoba was said to hold hundreds of thousands of volumes, a collection that dwarfed anything in contemporary Europe. But its true power was not in its size but in its purpose. It was a living interface, a place where the intellectual traditions of the Islamic, Jewish, and Christian worlds met, debated, and cross-pollinated. A physician could consult a Greek text in its Arabic translation alongside a Jewish scholar's commentary and a Christian monk's notes. This was not a quiet archive. It was a bustling, vibrant marketplace of ideas. The real magic, however, happened in the city of Toledo after its reconquest by Christian kingdoms. Instead of destroying the vast Arabic libraries they found, the new rulers saw their value. They established what became famous as the School of Translators. This was the network's most brilliant collaborative node. Picture a workshop where a team of scholars, each bringing a different piece of the puzzle, worked side by side. A Mozarabic Christian, fluent in the local Arabic dialect, would read the text aloud. A Jewish scholar, versed in both Arabic and Hebrew, would help interpret the concepts. A Latin-speaking cleric would then craft the final, elegant Latin translation. This meticulous group effort meant that a single idea could complete an incredible journey. A philosophical work by Aristotle, lost in the original Greek to Western Europe, might exist in a Syriac translation. That Syriac version was then translated into Arabic in Baghdad. That Arabic text traveled to the library in Cordoba, and finally, in Toledo, it was collaboratively rendered into Latin, the scholarly language of medieval Europe. This process did not just move words from one language to another. It filtered and refined them through multiple layers of understanding. The works of towering Islamic thinkers like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, and the physician Al-Razi, known as Rhazes, entered the European intellectual bloodstream here. Their encyclopedic works on medicine, philosophy, and science became the standard textbooks in the new universities sprouting up in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. So when we trace the origins of the European Renaissance, we must look back to these translation tables in Toledo. The network had performed its ultimate function. It had taken knowledge preserved in one civilization, enhanced it in a second, and then, through unprecedented cooperation, delivered it, transformed and ready to a third. The spark from Alexandria, carried through Baghdad and the monasteries, was now a torch, and it was about to be passed into the hands of a machine. While the translation workshops of Toledo were busy channeling knowledge west, another guardian stood watch in the east, holding a far older and more direct line to the source. The Byzantine Empire, with its magnificent capital of Constantinople, was not a link in the chain. It was the living, breathing continuation of the Roman world, and its libraries were vaults where the classical past never died. For over 1,000 years, while Western Europe transformed, the scholars of Byzantium worked in a different mode. Their task was not innovation or synthesis, but meticulous, reverent conservation. In quiet scriptoriums and imperial libraries, generations of scribes and scholars copied and recopied the foundational texts of Greek antiquity in their original language. This was Homer's Iliad, Plato's dialogues, the histories of Thucydides, preserved not as summaries or translations, but as exact, annotated originals. Think of it as a high-fidelity backup, maintained in a climate-controlled environment while other copies in the world grew faint or were rewritten. The Byzantine approach was deeply scholarly. They did not just copy words, they added layers of commentary in the margins, debates between generations of readers frozen on the parchment. A single manuscript of Aristotle could contain centuries of conversation, a silent symposium spanning the ages. This created a stream of knowledge that was pure, deep, and astonishingly direct. For the humanists in Italy who were beginning to rediscover the classical world through Latin translations of Arabic translations, this Byzantine stream was something they did not even know they were missing. Then, in the year 1453, the unthinkable happened. The great walls of Constantinople, which had stood for a millennium, were finally breached. The fall of the city was a profound human tragedy, a seismic event that reshaped the world. Yet, within that catastrophe, the ancient knowledge network performed one last vital function. As scholars and nobles fled the advancing forces, they did not travel light. They packed what they valued most, chests filled with precious codices, the very manuscripts they had spent their lives studying. They carried this treasure westward, seeking refuge in the city-states of Italy. The effect was electric. For the first time, scholars in Florence, Venice, and Rome could hold in their hands pristine Greek texts of Plato's Republic or Ptolemy's Geography, works they had only known through fragmented or second-hand versions. It was the difference between hearing a story retold and hearing the author's own voice. This sudden, accidental infusion of primary sources supercharged the Italian Renaissance. Humanists like Marsilio Ficino could now translate Plato directly from Greek into Latin, creating a new and more accurate foundation for European philosophy. The flood of manuscripts from Constantinople provided the authentic spark, proving that political collapse, while devastating, could forcibly transplant an entire library of thought into fertile new ground. The network, once again, had found a way to turn loss into legacy. The true architecture of this knowledge network was not built of stone or parchment, but of human hands and unwavering focus. Behind every surviving line of Plato or Galen stood a scribe, a figure whose name is almost always lost to history, yet whose disciplined labor formed the single most critical link in the entire chain. Whether he was a royal clerk in the sunlit halls of Alexandria, a monk in a frigid scriptorium whose breath fogged the air, or a professional copyist in a bustling Baghdad workshop, his role was identical. He was a human conduit, a living channel through which ideas flowed from one generation to the next. This was not mere clerical work. It was a craft that demanded immense skill and profound patience. The scribe had to master a consistent, beautiful hand, prepare his own inks and parchments, and understand the complex layout of a codex. His entire world shrank to the page before him, a rectangle of prepared sheepskin or papyrus. For hours, days, sometimes years, his existence was the rhythmic scratch of the quill, the careful formation of each letter, the precise replication of a text he may or may not have fully understood. He was, in the most literal sense, a human printing press before the machine existed, and the network's resilience depended entirely on the quality and dedication of thousands of such individuals. Yet this process was never perfectly sterile. It was human, and therefore subject to fascinating imperfections that often added new value. A tired scribe might accidentally skip a line or mishear a word being read aloud, introducing an error that could then be copied for centuries. But more intriguing were the deliberate additions. In the margins of these ancient texts, we find the quiet voices of the copyists themselves. A monk, puzzled by a complex passage in a geometry text, might write a brief note explaining it in simpler terms. A scholar in Baghdad, translating a medical text, might add a marginal observation from his own practice, noting, "I have seen this treatment work," or "this dosage seems too strong." These glosses, as they are called, are like whispers across time. They transform a static text into a living conversation, connecting a reader in the 10th century directly with a reader in the 15th, who might then add his own comment beneath it. These anonymous figures, then, were the ultimate curators and influencers of intellectual history. Their daily choices determined everything. Which text was deemed important enough to spend 6 months copying, which damaged manuscript was repaired, and which was left to crumble. A scribe's personal interest could rescue a minor philosophical work from oblivion, while his lack of interest could condemn a major text to loss. They decided not only what survived, but how it was presented, the clarity of the diagrams, the helpfulness of the summaries, the tone of the marginalia. We think of great libraries as the repositories of knowledge, but it was the scribe, alone with his tools and his focus, who built those repositories one painstaking letter at a time. Their quiet, relentless labor laid every single stone in the foundation of modern thought, making them the unsung engineers of our entire world of ideas. And their greatest legacy was about to be handed to a machine that could mimic their work 1,000 times over, but would never replicate the thoughtful whisper they left in the margin. The scribe's quill preserved the letter, but it was the translator's mind that had to preserve the spirit. These figures were the true cultural alchemists of the ancient knowledge network, tasked with a far more perilous and creative act than simple copying. They did not just swap words from one language to another. They built conceptual bridges across vast chasms of thought, making entire worlds of knowledge intelligible to entirely new civilizations. Think of a translator like Hunayn ibn Ishaq, working in the bustling house of wisdom in 9th century Baghdad. His mission was to render the complex medical works of the Greek physician Galen into Arabic. But the languages shared almost no common scientific vocabulary. There was no Arabic word for a specific bone or a particular philosophical idea. So Hunayn and his team had to invent them, forging new terms from the raw material of their own language, or borrowing and adapting words from Persian or Syriac. This was not translation, it was intellectual architecture, constructing a whole new framework for understanding the human body within Arabic thought. The text that emerged was not a perfect mirror of the original. It was a new creation, infused with the translator's own deep understanding, often including clarifying notes and corrections based on later medical practice. It was Galen, but it was also something more, a hybrid text that could now thrive in its new environment. Centuries later and a continent away, a similar alchemy was at work in the shadow of the Toledo Cathedral. A scholar like Gerard of Cremona, driven by a thirst for the knowledge preserved in Arabic, spent decades leading collaborative translation efforts. He was not just moving Aristotle's works on logic from Arabic to Latin. He was navigating a minefield of concepts that had no equivalent in medieval Christian scholasticism. A single Arabic term for a metaphysical principle might require a full Latin sentence to explain, or the invention of a clumsy new word that would, over time, become polished and precise through use. This process meant that every idea was filtered, interpreted, and subtly reshaped. A Greek philosophical concept, first expanded by an Islamic commentator in Baghdad, then rendered into Latin by a team in Toledo, emerged changed. Some nuances were inevitably lost, but astonishingly, new layers of meaning were often gained through this very process of cultural negotiation. This was the network's brilliant immune system. By forcing knowledge to adapt, to learn a new language and justify itself within a new worldview, the translation process tested its strength. Weak or poorly articulated ideas might fail to make the jump. But the robust, valuable concepts not only survived, they were strengthened, their logic refined by the need to explain themselves to a foreign mind. The translator, then, was the ultimate facilitator of intellectual evolution. They proved a profound lesson that echoes in our own digital age. For an idea to truly live beyond its birthplace, it cannot remain locked in its original form. It must be willing to be translated, not just in language but in context. It must learn to speak to the needs, the questions, and the frameworks of the next generation, or it risks becoming a beautiful artifact, admired but never truly understood. The work of these alchemists ensured that the flame of inquiry was not merely kept alive, but continuously fed new fuel, preparing it for the moment it would ignite a revolution in how humanity saw itself and the universe. But the grand libraries and quiet scriptoriums were only the fixed nodes. The lifeblood of this entire system was movement, a constant flow carried by the most ancient technology of all, the traveler. Ideas do not migrate on their own. They needed couriers, and these couriers were not specialized librarians. They were pilgrims, merchants, mapmakers, and diplomats, each weaving knowledge into the ordinary fabric of their journeys. The network's true resilience came from this human mesh, a web of chance encounters and informal trades that no central authority could ever design or control. Consider the pilgrimage routes crisscrossing medieval Europe and the Middle East. A monk like the Venerable Bede, though he rarely traveled himself, was a hub in a vast correspondence network. Pilgrims walking to Rome or Jerusalem would carry letters and sometimes whole books between monasteries, acting as a slow but reliable postal service for scholarship. A theological text copied in York could, over a generation of such journeys, find its way to a library in northern Italy, carried in a pilgrim's satchel next to a crust of bread and a vial of holy water. Meanwhile, along the Silk Road and Mediterranean sea lanes, Jewish merchant families operated a different kind of network, trading spices, silks, and gems between Cairo and Genoa. They also traded in something far more portable and valuable: information. Their business relied on trust, multilingual skill, and far-flung connections. In their luggage, alongside bolts of cloth, they might carry a newly translated medical text from Cordoba to a physician patron in Sicily, or a philosophical treatise from Baghdad to a scholar in Marseille. For them, knowledge was another commodity, one that built prestige and cemented relationships with powerful clients. Then there were the scholar adventurers, individuals hired for their minds. A figure like the Arab geographer Al-Idrisi spent years at the court of the Norman King Roger II in Sicily. His life's work, the Book of Roger, was a masterpiece of synthesis. He did not just consult old Greek texts. He interviewed Norman sailors, Arab merchants, and travelers from across the known world, compiling their first-hand observations into stunningly accurate maps and descriptions. His work was a physical product of the network, a single volume that contained whispered stories from 100 different sources. Perhaps the most elegant vector for knowledge, however, was the diplomatic gift. When rulers sought to impress or forge alliances, they often sent lavishly illustrated manuscripts, works of science or philosophy. A Byzantine emperor might send a gorgeous copy of Ptolemy's astronomy to a Persian Shah. A Mongol Khan, after sacking a city, might spare its scholars and send them as gifts to a rival court, effectively transplanting an entire school of thought. This turned politics into an unintentional engine of cultural exchange. The strength of this human network was its beautiful unpredictability. It was not a planned circuit. It was a vast, organic mesh. A Greek text on mathematics saved from Constantinople might find its way onto a Venetian galley. That galley could be captured by pirates, its cargo sold in Tunis, where the book is bought by a Spanish monk who takes it to a monastery in the Pyrenees. From there, a visiting scholar makes a copy and carries it to the University of Paris. The path is chaotic, illogical, and utterly human. This meant the network could survive the collapse of any single library or empire because the knowledge had already escaped into the wild, carried in the saddlebags and ship holds of 1,000 ordinary people going about their business. The idea was no longer tied to a place. It was tied to the movement of humanity itself, always finding a new path, always seeking a curious mind. And as this scattered, living library grew, it began to generate a new kind of problem, one of navigation. How did anyone find the specific idea they needed in this sea of scattered texts? The answer lies in the invention of the most crucial tool for managing knowledge since writing itself. The chaotic, human-powered network needed a container, and the shape of that container changed everything. The physical form of knowledge itself was a silent partner in its own survival, a technology as crucial as the words it carried. In the great libraries of antiquity, knowledge took the shape of the scroll. This was a linear, sequential world. To read a text, you unrolled it from one rod to another, following a single, unbroken path. It was elegant, but it was also fragile and awkward. Finding a specific passage meant rolling and unrolling, a process that strained the material. The scroll was a river you could only navigate from its source to its sea, never jumping to a bend in the middle. Its dominant material, papyrus, was made from pressed reeds. It was relatively cheap and widely produced, but it had a fatal flaw. In damp climates, it molded and dissolved. A papyrus scroll was a whisper on a fragile leaf, easily lost to time or a leaky roof. Then came a quiet revolution in format, one that would redefine the architecture of thought. Early Christian communities, seeking a durable way to circulate their letters and gospels, began adopting the Codex. This was simply a stack of sheets, folded and bound along one edge, what we recognize today as a book. To the Roman world, it seemed a humble, utilitarian object, like replacing a fine tapestry with a stack of notepaper, but its advantages were profound. The Codex was random access. You could flip to any page, compare passages side by side, and easily bookmark a spot. It was far more portable and durable. Its protective covers shielded the pages within. And crucially, it used both sides of the writing material, packing more text into a smaller, sturdier package. This was not an incremental improvement. It was a paradigm shift in information technology, turning knowledge from a flowing stream into a terrain you could explore. The choice of material evolved alongside this new form. As the Codex gained prominence, parchment began to replace papyrus. Parchment was made from treated animal skin, scraped, soaked, and stretched until it became a smooth, incredibly resilient surface. It was expensive. A single large Bible might require the skins of hundreds of animals, but it was a fortress for words. Unlike papyrus, parchment could survive centuries of handling, moisture, and even neglect. A parchment codex could fall into a cellar, be soaked, dry out, and still be legible 1,000 years later. This durability meant that for the first time, a text had a real chance to outlive not just its author, but entire civilizations. The investment in such a material also meant that what was written upon it was deemed worthy of that longevity, influencing which texts were chosen for preservation. The victory of the Codex over the scroll fundamentally rewired the knowledge network. It enabled the personal library. A scholar could now own and carry a small chest of codices, a portable university. It allowed for complex reference work, encyclopedias, glossaries, and heavily annotated editions because one could easily cross-reference between different sections of a single volume or between multiple books. The very act of thinking changed. Scholarship became less about reciting a linear narrative and more about building arguments by assembling evidence from disparate pages. The network's nodes were no longer just great repositories. They could be small, private collections, each codex a seed that could spawn infinite copies. The humble bound book, born from practical need, became the most resilient vessel ever devised for the human mind. A technology so perfect that its basic design would remain unchallenged for over 1,500 years. But a vessel, no matter how perfect, is useless without a map to its contents. A codex could survive a flood, but not a torch. For all their ingenuity, the networks that carried ancient knowledge were terrifyingly fragile, balanced perpetually on a razor's edge between preservation and total oblivion. The true enemy was not time alone, but the sudden, violent shock of disaster. A single spark in a library annex, a political decree ordering the destruction of philosophical texts, the rumble of an approaching army, these were the catastrophic data loss events of the ancient and medieval world. They acted like a cosmic filter on human thought, determining which ideas would pass into the future and which would vanish forever. Consider the slow, silent decay of papyrus scrolls in a damp climate. Without constant recopying, the very material would dissolve, turning a treatise on astronomy into unreadable pulp within a few generations. This was a passive, pervasive threat, a background hum of loss against which every scribe worked. But far more dramatic were the acute disasters. The famous burning of the Library of Alexandria's annex, whether by accident or conflict, represents a profound rupture. While scholars debate the scale, the symbolic truth remains. A concentrated repository of unique texts could be erased in a night. Centuries later, an even more definitive event reshaped the East. In 1258, Mongol forces besieged and sacked Baghdad. Historical accounts describe the Tigris River running black with ink from the countless manuscripts thrown from the libraries of the House of Wisdom. This was not collateral damage, it was the deliberate dismantling of a civilization's intellectual heart. The loss was incalculable, a deletion of centuries of refined scholarship, translation, and original research. These disasters were not mere endings. They were defining forces that actively shaped the evolution of the knowledge network itself. Each catastrophe created a bottleneck. Imagine a vast river of information suddenly forced through a narrow pipe. Only what had already passed through, what had been copied many times and scattered widely to other nodes, survived the constriction. A text that existed in only 1 or 2 copies in Baghdad likely perished, but a medical manual by Galen or Al-Razi, which had been copied and sent to Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba, lived on. This imposed a brutal, unconscious form of natural selection on ideas. The survival of a text often depended less on its inherent truth or brilliance and more on practical factors. Was it popular? Was it useful for teaching medicine, law, or theology? Did it align with the religious or political powers of the era who would fund its copying? A beautifully argued but obscure philosophical dialogue might fade away, while a standard surgical textbook was reproduced relentlessly, simply because every new physician needed a copy. This is the sobering, humbling reality of knowledge's journey. The library that burns teaches a stark lesson. Preservation is never guaranteed. It is a race against entropy, powered by human diligence and luck. The networks we've traced were not just pathways for transmission. They were also a survival strategy, a response to this ever-present fragility. Each copied manuscript, each translation, each book carried by a fleeing scholar was a desperate and beautiful act of defiance against the darkness of forgetting. It forces us to ask a haunting question about our own digital age. What are we choosing to save, and what might we, through neglect or accident, be leaving to burn? Gutenberg's press was a thunderclap in a world of whispers. For over 1,000 years, the knowledge network had operated on a principle of scarcity, where every new copy of a text represented months of dedicated labor and a significant investment of wealth. The printing press, with its movable type and oil-based ink, shattered that economy forever. It was the moment the network evolved from a fragile, hand-stitched web into a roaring, industrial engine of dissemination. Where a monastic scriptoria might produce 1 or 2 copies of a recovered classical text in a year, a single printing shop could now run off hundreds of identical copies in a matter of weeks. The effect was explosive. A Greek philosophical work, painstakingly preserved in a single Byzantine manuscript and then carried to Italy, could suddenly be replicated and shipped to scholars in Paris, London, and Krakow almost simultaneously. The slow, perilous trickle of manuscripts became a continent-wide flood of printed books. This mechanization did something profound. it democratized access to the very ideas that had been so carefully guarded. Knowledge was no longer the exclusive property of wealthy patrons, royal libraries, or cloistered religious orders. A merchant with means could now own a personal copy of Euclid's Geometry or a newly translated edition of Plato. This broke the intellectual monopolies that had controlled the flow of information for centuries, and it unleashed forces that would reshape the world. The most immediate and turbulent consequence was the Reformation. Martin Luther's 95 Theses criticizing practices of the Church were not just written, they were printed and distributed with astonishing speed. The debate over faith was no longer confined to Latin-speaking theologians in university halls. It was happening in pamphlets and vernacular Bibles read in homes and taverns across Germany and beyond. The printing press had given a megaphone to dissent and made religious interpretation a matter for the individual conscience, fundamentally altering the political and spiritual landscape of Europe. Equally transformative was the press's role in the scientific revolution. Before print, a scholar's new theory about the planets or anatomy might circulate in a few handwritten letters to colleagues, easily lost or misunderstood. Now, the work of Copernicus, Galileo, or Vesalius could be published in detailed, illustrated volumes with identical diagrams on every page. This created a stable, common reference point for debate. A scientist in England could point to a specific page, line, and figure in a text owned by a counterpart in Italy, and they could be certain they were discussing exactly the same evidence. Its standardized knowledge dramatically reduced the copying errors that had plagued manuscripts for millennia and allowed for the rapid, cumulative building of discovery upon discovery. The press did not replace the ancient network of scribes, translators, and travelers. It supercharged it. That network had spent centuries gathering, filtering, and preserving the raw materials. The press took those refined materials and built a city with them. It proved a timeless lesson that while human curiosity plants the seeds of ideas, it is always a leap in technology that irrigates the field, allowing a sudden, breathtaking harvest. The great acceleration had begun, setting the stage for the next, invisible layer of the network, one built not of parchment or paper, but of electrons and light. The printed book created a flood, but a flood without order is just chaos. To navigate the vast new seas of knowledge, humanity needed maps, and the first cartographers of this intellectual world were not explorers but librarians. Their invention was deceptively simple, a tool so fundamental we now take it for granted, the Catalogue. In the storied halls of Alexandria, a scholar named Callimachus faced a problem of unprecedented scale. The library was collecting scrolls from every corner of the known world, but how could anyone find a specific text among hundreds of thousands? His solution was the Pinax, or tables. This was not a simple list. It was a sophisticated attempt to impose order on the universe of thought, organizing works by genre, by author, and by subject. For the first time, a seeker could locate a tragedy by Euripides or a medical treatise by Hippocrates without wandering the endless shelves. This was the birth of information science, the realization that preserving knowledge was meaningless without a system to retrieve it. The Catalogue was the invisible architecture that turned a warehouse of scrolls into a usable library, the operating system for the entire network. As collections grew in the medieval world, the challenge became even more acute. Monastic libraries, though smaller, contained a precious mix of scripture, classical philosophy, and practical science. Scholars developed intricate indexing systems, often writing subject guides in the blank pages at the front or back of a codex. But perhaps the most fascinating tool was not written down at all. It was the ars memoriae, the art of memory. In a world where books were rare and consulting them during a debate or sermon was impractical, scholars trained themselves to hold vast libraries in their mind. They would visualize a familiar place, like a cathedral or a palace, and mentally place ideas, quotes, and arguments in specific rooms on specific shelves. To recall a point, they would simply take a mental walk through their memory palace and retrieve it. This was not mere rote memorization. It was a profound method of organizing information spatially, creating a personal, internal catalogue where every idea had a designated place. These classification schemes, whether etched on clay or constructed in the mind, were the true software of the ancient knowledge network. They did not just store facts, they created relationships. By deciding that a work on astronomy belonged next to one on mathematics, or that a philosophical text should be indexed under ethics rather than metaphysics, these early librarians were drawing conceptual maps. These maps, in turn, guided all future scholarship. A student trained with a certain catalogue would come to see the connections it highlighted as natural and true, shaping the very questions he thought to ask. The way we categorize knowledge determines what patterns we can see. It decides whether a discovery in chemistry is linked to medicine or to alchemy, whether a historical text is read as fact or as legend. This ancient principle is the silent engine beneath our modern world. When you type a query into an internet search, you are invoking the ghost of Callimachus. The algorithms that sort and rank results are our digital pinakes, vast invisible catalogues that decide which fragments of our global library you will see first, and in what order. They create the conceptual map of our age, influencing what connections we make and what truths we believe are most important. The ancient librarians understood a profound secret, that the container for an idea is never neutral. The index, the catalogue, the search bar, these are not passive tools. They are active shapers of thought, the hidden code that has always governed what we remember and ultimately what we can become. A single illuminated manuscript could cost as much as a small farm. Behind every preserved line of philosophy or medicine lay a stark economic reality. The great knowledge networks were not just intellectual endeavors, they were monumental financial investments, powered by the wealth of kings and the quiet commerce of artisans. The Ptolemies of Alexandria did not fund their library out of pure altruism. They were investing in the soft power of prestige, creating a magnet for the world's greatest minds that would, in turn, attract trade, innovation, and political influence to their city. Centuries later, the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun operated on a similar principle. His funding of the House of Wisdom's translation movement was a strategic venture, an attempt to consolidate the intellectual capital of conquered empires into a unified Islamic framework, thereby strengthening his rule and fueling advancements in medicine, astronomy, and engineering. These rulers were the original venture capitalists of ideas, betting vast sums on the long-term returns of knowledge. This system of patronage reached a new zenith during the Renaissance. In Florence, Cosimo de' Medici, a banker whose wealth rivaled nations, financed the search for and copying of ancient Greek and Latin manuscripts. He did not do this alone. He established a network of agents scouring monastic libraries across Europe and the Byzantine world, effectively creating an international intellectual procurement system. For a prince like Cosimo, a personal library was more than a collection. It was a direct line to the wisdom of antiquity, a tool for educating his courtiers, and a dazzling display of cultural sophistication that legitimized his family's political power. The choice of which texts to hunt down and copy was not made by scholars alone. It was heavily influenced by the tastes and ambitions of the patron. A ruler interested in statecraft would fund the recovery of Roman histories and political theory. One fascinated by the natural world would prioritize works on botany or geography. The Economics of Patronage, therefore, acted as a powerful filter, deciding which strands of the classical past were pulled most vigorously into the present. Beyond the glittering courts, an entire economy hummed to support the trade in knowledge. This was not a niche market. it was a sophisticated supply chain. In major cities, specialized guilds regulated the work of parchment makers, who prepared the skins of calves, sheep, or goats through a laborious, months-long process. Ink makers traded in rare pigments, grinding lapis lazuli for brilliant blues or using oak galls for deep black ink. The most skilled copyists and illuminators, especially those who could illustrate texts with intricate miniatures and gold leaf, commanded fees that could support a family for years. A single commissioned Bible might represent the collaborative work of dozens of these artisans over several years, a capital investment frozen in vellum and ink. This made books objects of tremendous inherent value, often listed alongside land and jewels in wills and inventories. When a monastery lent a book to another, it was not a casual loan. It was a transaction of serious financial consequence, often requiring a deposit of equal value to ensure the precious object's return. The result was a profound tension at the heart of the knowledge network. The very cost that ensured a text's luxurious survival also restricted its access. A library, whether in a royal palace or a wealthy monastery, was a fortress of wealth as much as wisdom. Its locked doors and chained books were practical measures to protect a fortune. This economic barrier meant that for centuries, deep scholarship remained the domain of the elite or those sponsored by them. The flow of ideas, therefore, was never a pure democratic stream. It was a directed current channeled by the interests and resources of the powerful. A brilliant but obscure text on a seemingly impractical subject might languish, unpurchased and uncopied, simply because no patron saw value in it. The survival of knowledge through the ages thus reflects not only its intellectual merit, but also its perceived utility, beauty, or alignment with the prevailing sources of wealth. It is a reminder that the history of ideas is inextricably woven with the history of capital, a partnership that built the libraries of the past and continues, in new forms, to shape the digital archives of our future. Power rarely enjoys a surprise. For all its grandeur, the ancient knowledge network existed in constant tension with those who ruled the societies it flowed through. Kings, emperors, and religious authorities understood that ideas were not neutral. They could stabilize a throne or shatter it, uphold dogma or inspire dangerous doubt. So alongside the patrons who funded libraries, there existed a parallel impulse to control the river of knowledge, to dam certain streams and redirect others toward what was deemed useful and safe. This was not a minor friction. It was a fundamental force that actively sculpted the landscape of what survived. A ruler might enthusiastically fund the copying of texts on agriculture, engineering, or medicine, disciplines that strengthened the state and improved public health. These were the tools of empire, the applied knowledge that built aqueducts, increased crop yields, and kept armies healthy. But that same ruler might view a philosophical treatise questioning the divine right of kings, or a religious text from a rival sect as a direct threat to the social order. The response was often swift and severe. In ancient China, the first emperor Qin Shi Huang is famously said to have ordered the burning of books and the burial of scholars who espoused competing philosophies, an attempt to unify thought under a single, state-approved doctrine. Centuries later in Rome, Emperor Augustus purged texts he considered subversive from libraries, promoting instead literature that celebrated the new imperial age. This filtering was not always through fire. It could be subtler, a matter of funding and access. A scriptorium under the control of a particular religious order would naturally prioritize copying scripture, approved theological commentaries, and texts that aligned with its worldview. Works of pagan philosophy or alternative spiritual ideas might simply be ignored, left to molder on a shelf because no one was paid to recopy them. They died not from prohibition, but from neglect, a quiet censorship of omission. The most formalized system of this control emerged later, with the Catholic Church's Index of Prohibited Books. This was a centuries-long, institutional effort to catalogue and ban publications deemed heretical or morally harmful. To own or distribute a book on that list was a serious offense, yet here we see the network's most resilient feature, its ability to route around damage. Official censorship often produced the exact opposite of its intended effect. A banned text gained a powerful new allure, a reputation for containing forbidden truths. Secret networks sprang up to circulate these works. They were smuggled in false-bottomed chests, passed hand to hand in private gatherings, and printed in hidden presses far from the authorities' reach. The very act of suppression turned a book into a symbol of intellectual rebellion, ensuring it was read with intense, subversive passion by those who managed to obtain a copy. This clandestine exchange became its own vital thread in the larger network. It meant that dangerous ideas never truly disappeared. They simply went underground, moving through private libraries, scholarly correspondence, and covert reading circles. The tension between sharing and controlling, therefore, created a constant, dynamic negotiation. Power could influence the mainstream flow, promoting a canonical set of texts that defined official knowledge. But the network's decentralized, human-powered nature meant it always had shadow channels, back alleys through which prohibited thoughts could travel. What we inherit as the classical canon, the collection of Greek and Roman works that shaped the West, is not a pure, objective library of the best ideas. It is a curated collection, a testament to what successive powers and traditions found valuable, useful, or at least not threatening enough to destroy. It is equally a testament to the stubborn individuals who, at personal risk, preserved and passed along the texts that challenged those very powers. The history of knowledge is not just a record of what was saved. It is also a map of what was fought over, hidden, and defiantly shared, proving that the desire to understand cannot be permanently contained by any wall, whether made of stone or of decree. The parchments were silent, but the air was full of voices. For all the power of the written word, the most ancient and pervasive network for knowledge operated not through ink, but through breath and memory. This was the parallel universe of oral tradition, a living library that required no shelves and feared no fire, carried in the minds and on the tongues of countless individuals. In the stone refectories of medieval monasteries, the written word was given life through sound. During meals, a monk would read aloud from a sacred text or a work of history in a practice known as lectio divina, divine reading. The community did not just hear the words, they ingested them, reflecting on their meaning and committing passages to memory through repetition. This ritual transformed a static text on a page into a shared, internalized experience, ensuring that even if the physical book was lost, its core teachings lived on in the hearts of the listeners. Half a world away, in Islamic scholarly circles, oral transmission was not a supplement to writing, but the foundation of a rigorous legal and theological science. The verification of hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, depended on the isnad system. This was a meticulous chain of oral attestation, a scholar citing the person from whom he heard a teaching, who would cite his own teacher, creating an unbroken human lineage stretching back to the original source. The integrity of the message was tied to the known reliability and character of every single person in that living chain. It was a network built on trust and personal accountability, proving that an idea could be transmitted with astonishing fidelity across centuries without ever being written down. Beyond these formal structures, the true engine of this living library was the storyteller. In villages from Ireland to India, bards, griots, and elders held the collective memory of their people. They carried epic poems like the Iliad or the Sundiata, legal precedents, genealogies, and moral parables. This knowledge was not recited by rote. It was performed, adapted, and reinterpreted with each telling to fit new audiences and changing circumstances. A story about a king's bravery might subtly shift to emphasize wisdom during a time of peace, or to highlight justice during a period of conflict. The oral tradition was dynamic, a constantly updating software for cultural values and historical identity. This fluid network served two critical functions for the broader system of knowledge. First, it acted as a vital backup for written records. In eras of widespread illiteracy, which encompassed most of human history, the vast majority of people accessed complex ideas, laws, and history only through this spoken word. A farmer might never read a law code, but he knew the customary rights and responsibilities passed down by the village elder. Second, it provided a dissemination system that written texts could not match. A single traveling bard could carry the entire cultural memory of a civilization into the most remote hamlet, performing for dozens or hundreds in an evening. The lesson here is profound. The most resilient knowledge networks are never monolithic. They are hybrid systems. The fixed, permanent record of the written word provides stability and a check against the drift of memory. But the fluid, adaptive, communal nature of oral tradition provides reach, relevance, and an incredible capacity for survival. One can burn a library, but it is impossible to silence every voice in a generation. The true architecture of preserved thought was always a symphony, a harmony between the enduring mark on the page and the unforgettable echo in the air. Even the greatest library is useless if you cannot find the single fact you need. Long before the digital age, scholars faced an overwhelming tide of information, a flood of scrolls and codices that threatened to drown inquiry in sheer volume. Their solution was to build synthesis machines, not of gears and levers, but of parchment and ink. These were the encyclopedists, the master summarizers who dedicated their lives to a single monumental task, condensing the entire known world into a single, manageable reference. Think of Pliny the Elder, a Roman admiral who spent every waking moment not commanding ships but compiling. His natural history was a staggering 37-volume attempt to catalogue everything from astronomy and geography to botany, art, and medicine, referencing over 2,000 works by hundreds of authors. He was not conducting experiments in a lab. He was a human search engine, crawling through the library of the ancient world to create a master index of reality itself. His work was a network hub in physical form, a single point where strands of knowledge from countless lost texts converged and were preserved. Centuries later, in the twilight of the Roman world in Spain, Bishop Isidore of Beauvais undertook a similar project for a darker time. His etymology, or etymologies, was born from a fear that the knowledge of antiquity was slipping away forever amidst political collapse. His method was fascinating. He believed the true meaning of any concept could be found in the origin of its name. So he organized his vast encyclopedia around words, tracing their linguistic roots to explain everything from the 7 liberal arts to the parts of a ship, from the nature of God to the habits of common animals. It was a desperate and brilliant act of salvage, creating a single textbook that could rebuild a civilization from its intellectual foundations. But the pinnacle of this medieval synthesis was the Speculum Maius, the Great Mirror, compiled by Vincent of Beauvais in the 13th century. This was perhaps the most ambitious reference work ever attempted before the printing press, a library distilled into 80 books and almost 10,000 chapters. Vincent did not just list facts. He synthesized, arranging excerpts from Greek, Roman, Islamic, and Christian authors into a coherent, moral view of the universe, divided into the mirror of nature, the mirror of doctrine, and the mirror of history. A Dominican friar or a royal administrator with no access to the great Library of Alexandria or Baghdad could open Vincent's mirror and find a digest of the world's wisdom, carefully categorized and ready for application. These colossal works were not original research in our modern sense. They were acts of supreme curation. The encyclopedist was the ultimate network node, reading, comparing, and excerpting from hundreds of sources, many of which have since vanished. Their genius lay in selection and arrangement. By choosing what was most important, most useful, or most aligned with a Christian worldview, they created a filtered stream of knowledge. This made them the essential study guides of the pre-modern world. A student could not possibly read every work of Aristotle or every medical treatise of Galen, but he could master Isidore's etymologies or large sections of Vincent's Mirror, absorbing the core principles. In doing so, these compendiums performed a vital, life-saving function for the network. When the original, lengthy source texts were lost to fire, decay, or neglect, the key ideas within them often lived on, quoted and preserved in these massive digests. They were the backup of the backup, ensuring that even if the full symphony was lost, the most memorable melodies were saved and could be sung again. They prove that in the ecology of knowledge, the summarizer is as crucial as the discoverer, for they decide what is memorable and therefore what endures. Ptolemy's star charts were a perfect mathematical cage for the heavens. In 2nd century Alexandria, the astronomer Claudius Ptolemy completed a work so comprehensive it would define reality for over 1,000 years. His great synthesis, known by its Arabic title, the Alchemist, presented a universe of breathtaking complexity and order. At its heart was the geocentric model, with a stationary Earth encircled by the moon, sun, planets, and fixed stars, all moving in a celestial dance of perfect circles upon circles. Ptolemy was not the first to propose this structure, but his genius was in the math. He introduced ingenious devices like epicycles and equants, complex geometric adjustments that could mathematically predict the observed, sometimes erratic, motions of the planets with remarkable accuracy. It was a system that worked, a clockwork universe captured in equations. The Alchemist did not just state an idea, it provided the full observational data and the detailed mathematical toolkit to prove it. This made it not a dogma, but a working scientific manual, a tool that could be used, tested, and ultimately challenged. Its first guardian was the Byzantine Empire. As the Western Roman world transformed, Greek-speaking scholars in Constantinople copied and recopied the Alchemist in its original language, preserving Ptolemy's precise calculations as a high-fidelity master copy for the future. It was a sacred text of science kept safe behind the great walls of the city, but its true journey was just beginning. That journey required a translation, a leap into a new intellectual language. When the Alchemist reached the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, it was not merely copied. It was subjected to the rigorous, collaborative scrutiny of Islamic astronomy. Scholars like the 9th century astronomer al-Battani did not take Ptolemy's word as final. Using newer, more precise observations made with advanced instruments like the astrolabe, al-Battani confirmed many of Ptolemy's calculations but also found slight discrepancies. He published his own refined tables, correcting figures for the solar year and the precession of the equinoxes. In Cordoba, the astronomer al-Zarqali built an even more sophisticated version of the astrolabe and used it to further refine planetary models. This was not rejection, it was respectful, meticulous improvement. The Arabic translations of the Alchemist were accompanied by volumes of critical commentary, questions, and amendments. The model was being stress-tested by a new generation of observers, and it was holding up remarkably well, yet the very process of testing was planting the seeds for its eventual overhaul. The network was doing its job, not freezing the idea in time, but keeping it alive and under active discussion. This enriched, annotated version of Ptolemaic astronomy then crossed the final bridge into medieval Europe. In the 12th century, the collaborative translation workshops of Toledo rendered the Alchemist and its Islamic commentaries from Arabic into Latin. Suddenly, scholars in Paris and Oxford had access not only to Ptolemy's original vision, but to centuries of cumulative critique and refinement from Baghdad and Cordoba. They inherited not a static truth, but a live scientific conversation. European astronomers built upon this foundation, using the transmitted tables to create their own navigational and calendrical tools. For centuries, the geocentric model reigned because it was phenomenally useful. It predicted eclipses, guided sailors, and structured the calendar. It was the operating system of the pre-modern world. Yet within the libraries of Europe, all the pieces for its revolution were now present. The original Greek idea, the Arabic corrections, and the mathematical language to express it all. The final act belonged to a Polish canon named Nicolaus Copernicus. Working in the early 16th century, he was deeply immersed in the very texts this network had delivered. The Greek editions of Ptolemy recovered from Byzantium and the Latin translations of Islamic astronomers. He saw the same enduring puzzles they had noted, the same mathematical clumsiness required to make the planets obey Ptolemy's circles. Copernicus's monumental insight was to consider a radical simplification. What if the sun, not the earth, was at the center? His famous work on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres was a direct continuation of the network dialogue. He cited his predecessors by name, building his case upon their own observations and acknowledging their work even as he proposed to overturn their fundamental assumption. He used the tools the network had preserved and refined, the geometry, the trigonometry, the very practice of precise observation, to construct a new model. Copernicus did not work in a vacuum. He was the beneficiary of a 1400-year-long conversation, a conversation that had flowed through the libraries of Alexandria, Constantinople, Baghdad, Cordoba, and finally to his own study. His revolution was the culmination of that dialogue, proving that a paradigm shifts not when an old idea is forgotten, but when it has been studied, tested, and improved for so long that its remaining flaws become impossible to ignore. The journey of the Alchemist shows us that science itself is a network, a slow, collaborative filtering of reality through many minds across many libraries in many tongues. A physician in medieval Paris could save a life using knowledge from a Greek who lived in Rome, filtered through Persian, Arabic, and Latin. The journey of medical ideas is perhaps the most human map of the ancient knowledge network, where abstract scholarship had immediate, tangible consequences in the quiet of a sick room. It begins with Galen, a Greek physician serving gladiators and emperors in 2nd century Rome. His prolific writings synthesized all known medical theory and anatomy of his time, creating a towering, systematic body of work. But like Ptolemy's star charts, Galen's texts needed a network to survive the coming collapse. They first flowed to Alexandria, where they were copied and studied, becoming the standard reference for generations. As political tides shifted, the center of medical gravity moved east, to a remarkable crossroads in Persia known as the Academy of Gondishapur. This was a sanctuary for scholars fleeing religious persecution in the Byzantine Empire, and it became a unique melting pot. Here, Greek medical texts were translated not into Arabic at first, but into Syriac, the language of local Christian scholars. These translators were often physicians themselves, adding their own practical notes and observations to Galen's theories. Gondishapur also welcomed knowledge from the East, incorporating medical wisdom from India, including sophisticated surgical techniques and a vast herbal pharmacopoeia. This pre-Islamic hub proved the model, blending Greek theory with Persian and Indian practice long before Baghdad's House of Wisdom rose to prominence. When the Abbasid caliphs built their intellectual empire, they absorbed Gondishapur's legacy whole. In Baghdad, the translation movement turned fully to medicine, rendering Galen's massive corpus and the accumulated insights from Persia and India into Arabic. This was not passive transfer, it was active creative integration. Physicians like Al-Razi, known in the West as Razes, embodied this spirit. He was a fierce empiricist. While he respected Galen, he trusted his own eyes more. In his vast hospital in Baghdad, he kept detailed clinical notes comparing Galen's predictions to actual patient outcomes. He wrote a groundbreaking treatise distinguishing smallpox from measles based on meticulous observation, a diagnostic leap built upon the foundation he had inherited but was not afraid to challenge. The culmination of this centuries-long synthesis came from the Persian polymath Ibn Sina, or Avicenna. His monumental work, The Canon of Medicine, was something new under the sun. It was not a translation nor a simple commentary. It was a complete, logically organized system of medicine, integrating Galenic theory, Aristotelian philosophy, Persian and Indian drug law, and his own clinical experience into a single, coherent 5-volume encyclopedia. The Canon became the ultimate textbook, a one-stop reference that could guide a physician from diagnosis to treatment for virtually any known ailment. Its clarity and comprehensiveness made it irresistible. The network's next critical transfer point was Toledo. As teams of translators worked there in the 12th century, the Canon of Medicine became a prime target. Rendered into Latin, it arrived in Western Europe just as a new institution was taking root, the university. At the pioneering medical schools of Salerno in Italy and Montpellier in France, the canon became the core curriculum. Students would spend years mastering its systematic approach, learning the theory of the four humours, the properties of hundreds of medicinal compounds, and complex diagnostic procedures. For the first time, a physician in France or England was being trained from the same foundational text as a physician in Damascus or Cairo. This created a common language of healing across the Mediterranean world. But the network's final, most beautiful link was the hospital. The very concept of the hospital as a place for healing, not just shelter, was refined in the Islamic world, inspired by the prophetic injunction to care for the sick. Great institutions like the Al-Mansuri Hospital in Cairo, founded in the 13th century, were marvels of applied knowledge. They had separate wards for different illnesses, libraries for physicians, pharmacies, and even music therapy for mental well-being. This model, infused with the synthesized medical knowledge of the canon, traveled to Europe. In Paris, the Hôtel du Hospital, though older in origin, began to adopt more systematic medical practices informed by the translated texts. The theoretical knowledge from the lecture halls of Salerno was now being applied at the bedside, creating a continuous loop between learning and practice. The result was a profound democratization of care, a treatment for a fever described by Galen, tested and modified by al-Razi in Baghdad, systematized by Ibn Sina, taught in Montpellier, and applied in a Parisian hospital, represents the network operating at its highest purpose. It shows that the transmission of knowledge was never an abstract academic game. It was a living, breathing system with direct, life-saving consequences. A surgical technique perfected in India could prevent infection in medieval Italy. A compound from a Persian herbal manual could ease pain in an English village. This medical web turned the collective suffering and curiosity of millennia into a practical toolkit for compassion, proving that when ideas travel freely across cultures, they don't just preserve the past, they actively build a better future. And as this global conversation healed bodies, another branch of the network was quietly assembling a different kind of map, one not of the human form, but of the entire world. The medical network healed bodies, but another branch was reassembling the very architecture of thought itself. Aristotle's return to the West was a philosophical thriller, a story of texts lost, found, and then found again. After the fragmentation of the Roman world, most of Aristotle's complex works on logic, physics, and metaphysics simply vanished from Western Europe's Latin libraries. They were too dense, too pagan, and too challenging for the immediate needs of a struggling society. But they did not die. They survived along two parallel tracks in the network, waiting for the moment their paths would converge and spark a revolution. In the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire, scribes continued to copy Aristotle's original texts with reverent precision, preserving them as part of their unbroken classical heritage. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles to the east, a different kind of preservation was underway. In the translation houses of Baghdad, Aristotle's works were rendered into Arabic, but they were not left alone. Islamic philosophers engaged with them not as relics, but as living puzzles. Thinkers like Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna, wrote vast, original commentaries attempting to reconcile Aristotelian logic with Islamic theology. In Islamic Spain, the Cordoban philosopher Ibn Rushd, known to the Latin West as Averroes, produced line-by-line analyses of Aristotle that were so clear and comprehensive they were simply called the commentaries. For these scholars, Aristotle was not an ancient authority to be memorized. He was the greatest of interlocutors, a partner in an ongoing, vibrant debate about the nature of reality, the soul, and God. This enriched Aristotle, and Aristotle, filtered through centuries of brilliant Islamic scholarship, was what first crashed into the medieval Latin world in the 12th century. In cities like Toledo, translators working from Arabic to Latin did not just recover the texts, they recovered the conversation. A European scholar opening a newly translated volume now encountered Aristotle's complex ideas already framed by Avicenna's metaphysical insights or clarified by Averroes's rigorous logic. The effect was nothing short of an intellectual earthquake. Here was a complete, rational system for understanding everything from the motion of objects to the workings of the mind, a system that seemed to operate by pure reason, independent of scripture. It was exhilarating and profoundly threatening. The university schools of Paris and Oxford were thrown into ferment. A new method called scholasticism arose directly from this collision. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas embarked on a monumental project, using the newly recovered Aristotelian toolkit of logic and categorization to systematically explore and defend Christian theology. They were not simply accepting the Islamic commentaries, they were arguing with them, using the same logical weapons to build a different philosophical edifice. The network had delivered not just answers, but the means for a whole new kind of questioning. Then, in the 15th century, the plot thickened. As scholars fled falling Constantinople, they brought with them the original, unmediated Greek texts of Aristotle and Plato. For the first time, humanists in Italy could compare the Latin translations made from Arabic with the pristine Greek originals. They discovered something startling. The Arabic pathway, while life-saving, had introduced layers of interpretation and occasional mistranslation. The Aristotle of Averroes was not quite the Aristotle of Athens. This second recovery, this direct line to the source, ignited the Renaissance. Scholars like Leonardo Bruni rushed to create new, more accurate translations from Greek into elegant Latin. The fresh, unadulterated voice of Aristotle, and especially the newly recovered dialogues of Plato, offered a vision of the classical world that was more literary, more human-centered, and in many ways more radical than the scholastic Aristotle of the universities. This double return, first through Arabic and then directly from Greek, is the ultimate proof of the network's non-linear genius. It was not a single, fragile thread. It was a redundant system. When one path was blocked by history, another remained open. When the first delivery was filtered and complex, the network provided a second, clearer signal. The philosophical foundations of the West were not built from a single recovered library. They were forged in the tension between these two streams, a centuries-long dialogue across 3 faiths and a dozen languages, all debating the same ancient words. The survival of an idea, it turns out, is not enough. Its true power is only unleashed when it is recovered twice and forced to explain itself all over again. The echoes of Alexandria and Baghdad are the echoes of what survived. For every library that passed its flame to the next generation, there were countless others whose light was snuffed out completely, leaving behind only the chilling silence of a ghost network. These are the libraries known only by a name in a chronicle, a line in an excavation report, or a pile of ash in an archaeological layer. Their loss represents not just the burning of books, but the severing of entire branches of the human family tree of ideas. Consider the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. Discovered in the 19th century, its cracked clay tablets bore the world's first known systematic library catalogue, a testament to an Assyrian king's obsession with gathering all knowledge, from epic poetry to medical prescriptions and detailed astronomical omens. We have its physical remains, but we lack the living context, the scholars who interpreted those omens, the oral traditions that gave the epics their full meaning. That library was a node in a Mesopotamian network we can only dimly perceive. Far across the world, in the dense rainforests of the Maya, scribes painted intricate glyphs in bark paper codices, recording their precise astronomical cycles, their history, and their complex understanding of time. Almost all of these books were destroyed, deemed idolatrous in a later era. Only 4 fragile codices are known to have survived. With them burned a unique American intellectual tradition, a way of seeing the universe woven from observations of Venus and the cycles of corn. We are left with silent stone stelae, their stories half told. And what of the great libraries of the Mali Empire in Timbuktu? While thousands of manuscripts on law, science, and poetry were miraculously preserved in private family collections, hinting at a vast scholarly network across medieval West Africa, we must wonder what grand central libraries, what official repositories of imperial knowledge, were lost to conflict, climate, or simply the slow decay of time. The contents of these ghost libraries represent more than missing information. They represent lost worldviews. An Assyrian omen text is not a primitive superstition. It is a sophisticated system for finding patterns in a seemingly chaotic universe, a different path to prediction that modern science never had the chance to engage with or learn from. A Malian legal treatise could reveal a completely different framework for justice, community, and governance that might reshape our understanding of human social organization. The silence in the historical record is not empty, it is eloquent. It speaks of the fragility of our collective memory. For every Aristotle whose works were saved by 3 separate networks, there were countless other thinkers in every culture whose revolutionary idea existed in a single vulnerable manuscript in a library that stood in the path of an army or a flood. What alternative path to calculus vanished in a Mesoamerican codex? What profound philosophy of peace was lost when a Central Asian monastery was abandoned? These ghost networks haunt our understanding, forcing a humbling realization. The history of ideas we have inherited is not the full story of human genius. It is the story of the survivors. It is the collection of texts that were lucky enough to be in the right place, deemed useful enough by the right people, and durable enough to outlast the relentless chaos of centuries. The surviving network we have traced is a miracle, but it is also a filter, and we must always wonder with a sense of both grief and awe what might have flourished in those severed branches, and how the shape of our world would be different if even one of those ghost libraries had whispered its secrets to the future. The ghost libraries represent a profound absence, but the network's ultimate triumph is written in the very institutions we walk through today. The medieval university was not a sudden invention. It was the ancient knowledge network finally building itself a permanent home. Those wandering scholars who once carried texts between monasteries and courts began to gather consistently in towns like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, clustering around master teachers who possessed coveted manuscripts. The cathedral school, where a translated text of Roman law or Aristotelian logic was studied, became the nucleus, Out of these informal gatherings, structure emerged, a structure directly inherited from the network's own logic. The faculty system organized knowledge into distinct streams: law, medicine, theology, and the arts, mirroring how ancient libraries had separated scrolls by subject. The curriculum itself was built from the very texts the network had delivered: the sentences of Peter Lombard for theology, the canon of Avicenna for medicine, the recovered works of Aristotle for natural philosophy. Earning a degree was, in essence, proving you had mastered the transmitted canon and could participate in the ongoing conversation. The university was and remains a physical manifestation of the network, a place designed to receive, debate, and then retransmit ideas to the next generation. At the heart of every campus stands its library, the direct architectural descendant of the scriptorium and the Great Hall of Scrolls. Its function is identical: to collect, preserve, and provide access. The quiet carrel where a student studies is the modern equivalent of the monk's desk. The interlibrary loan system that can deliver a rare monograph from across the world in days is the digital evolution of the monk traveling between monasteries with a book in his satchel. The library catalogue, now a vast digital database, is the direct heir of Callimachus's Pinax, an ever more sophisticated map to help us navigate an ocean of information that would have overwhelmed even the scholars of Alexandria. This is not a metaphor, it is a direct lineage, the impulse that drove a librarian in 9th century Baghdad to carefully shelve a translated Greek text next to a Persian commentary, is the same impulse that organizes a library's stacks today, creating physical proximity to spark intellectual connection. Most fundamentally, the entire scholarly method is a formalization of the ancient network's conversational model. The practice of citation, that small, meticulous act of naming your sources, is a modern version of the Islamic isnad chain or the scribe's marginal note. It builds a human lineage for ideas, acknowledging the shoulders upon which we stand. Peer review is the institutionalization of the collaborative translation workshop, where a community of experts scrutinizes new work for errors and insights before it joins the collective canon. Publishing a journal article is the academic equivalent of a scribe finishing a copy and sending it out into the world, hoping it will be picked up, debated, and used by other minds in distant places. Our global system of conferences, research grants, and digital repositories is simply the ancient network operating at light speed, a vast, conscious incarnation of the same organic processes that once moved knowledge on camelback and sailing ship. This means the patterns we have traced are not historical curiosities. They are hardwired into the very architecture of how humanity creates and validates knowledge. The Ptolemaic project to collect every book, the Abbasid drive to translate and synthesize, the monastic vow to preserve, all these ancient impulses now live on in our universities, our libraries, and our digital archives. We are still building the same network, just with new tools. Every time a researcher uploads a preprint to an open access server, they are placing a scroll on the digital dock of Alexandria. Every time a student follows a footnote to its original source, they are walking the same path as a scholar in Toledo, connecting an Arabic term back to its Greek root. The network never went away. It scaled up, becoming the invisible foundation of our modern world. And this legacy forces a crucial question upon us, the current stewards of this system. If the ancient networks were shaped by patronage, politics, and fragile technology, what unseen forces are shaping our global digital library? And what might we, perhaps unconsciously, be leaving in the shadows for future generations to wonder about? Our global digital library now operates at the speed of light. The Internet is the ancient knowledge network's final, breathtaking evolution, a library of Alexandria that exists everywhere and nowhere at once. It fulfills the Ptolemaic dream of collecting all information, not in one marble hall, but across billions of interconnected servers. It acts as a monastic scriptorium of infinite capacity, where a single idea can be copied and shared with the entire planet in seconds. And it functions as a perpetual translation house, where algorithms instantly render text and speech across hundreds of languages, continuing the work of Hunayn ibn Ishaq and Gerard of Cremona on a scale they could never have conceived. This is the ultimate decentralized network, a system so vast it seems to have solved the ancient problem of fragility by making every user a potential node for preservation and dissemination. Yet, this unprecedented power resurrects the oldest dilemmas of the knowledge network in startling new forms. Digital decay is our new papyrus rot. A web page, a research database, even a social media platform can vanish as completely as a scroll in a damp cellar. This phenomenon, called link rot, sees vital references and resources disappear into a silent digital void, leaving future historians with a trail of broken connections. The spread of misinformation and corrupted texts now travels at network speed, echoing the slow drift of errors introduced by a tired scribe, but amplified to a global cacophony in minutes. Our challenge is no longer a single monk mishearing a word, but complex networks designed to replicate and amplify distortions, testing the very immune system of our shared understanding. The ancient tensions between open access and control, between curation and chaos, have become the defining debates of our time. Who decides what is featured in the digital catalog, the algorithm that sorts our search results? How do we ensure equitable access to this new library when the cost is not a parchment codex, but a reliable internet connection and the literacy to navigate it? The great fires that threatened Alexandria and Baghdad have their modern equivalents in cyber attacks, server failures, and the deliberate deletion of digital archives. Understanding how the ancient network survived its crises offers us a crucial lens. Their solution was never a single, perfect library. It was redundancy. It was the multiplication of copies across geography and language. The lesson for our digital commons is profound. Preservation cannot rely on a single server, a single platform, or a single format. Just as monks in 100 monasteries copied texts, we must consciously and systematically back up our digital heritage in multiple, independent archives. The ancient respect for source tracing, for the Isnad chain of transmission, speaks directly to our need for digital provenance and citation, helping us distinguish an original observation from its thousandth corrupted share. The collaborative, multilingual model of Toledo reminds us that the best filters against error are diverse perspectives and transparent processes of verification. Our digital library is the greatest achievement of the human impulse to connect and know, but it is not a finished monument. It is a living, breathing network, and like all those before it, its future depends not on the technology itself, but on the choices of its curators, its translators, and every individual who contributes a piece of understanding. We are no longer just users of this network, we are its scribes. This timeless project is not locked away in history books. It is a living blueprint, a manual for building something powerful and personal, your own knowledge network. The patterns of Alexandria, Baghdad, and the monastic Scriptoria are not relics. They are roles you can step into today, transforming how you learn, think, and contribute to the world's conversation. Your mind is the library, and you are its chief librarian, translator, and scribe. The first step is conscious curation. Just as the Ptolemies sent agents to gather texts from every dock, you can deliberately build a personal collection of resources. This is more than a reading list. It is a diverse, cross-referenced archive of books, articles, documentaries, and trusted voices that challenge and expand your worldview. Seek out the modern equivalents of those Silk Road travelers, the writers and thinkers from fields far outside your own, who carry ideas that feel foreign. Bring them into your collection. This active, intentional gathering is the foundation. Next, embrace the role of the translator. This does not mean learning ancient languages, though that is a beautiful pursuit. It means developing the skill of taking a complex idea from one domain, say a principle from ecology or a concept from cognitive psychology, and translating it into your own life's context. Explain it to a friend in simple terms. Write a short summary in your own words. This act of translation, of making an idea your own through explanation, is how you move from passive consumption to true integration. It is the difference between a scroll sitting on a shelf and a text being actively debated and annotated in a Baghdad workshop, then become a node in the human network. The solitary monk in his scriptorium was part of a vast correspondence. Your scholarly exchanges happen through conversation, debate, and collaborative projects. Share what you are learning, engage with others who see the world differently. Write, even if only for yourself. The act of writing is the scribe's discipline, forcing clarity and creating a permanent record of your thinking that you can revisit and refine. This is how you move from being a repository to being a source, adding your own marginal notes to the great text of human understanding. Finally, be the traveler. Venture deliberately into intellectual territories that feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Follow a curiosity down a rabbit hole. Read a historian's take on a scientific revolution or a poet's reflection on a mathematical truth. This exposure to unfamiliar perspectives is the lifeblood of the network, preventing your personal library from becoming an echo chamber. It ensures your inner catalog remains dynamic, constantly creating new connections between seemingly disparate ideas. By consciously adopting these ancient roles, you do more than just learn. You become an active participant in the same resilient system that saved geometry from oblivion and carried medical knowledge across continents. You ensure that the valuable ideas you encounter do not end with you. You copy them through conversation, you translate them through explanation, and you pass them on through your work and your relationships. In doing so, you honor every anonymous scribe who bent over a parchment by candlelight, every translator who wrestled with a foreign concept, and every traveler who carried a precious book across a mountain pass. You take your place in the lineage, contributing your own voice to the endless, evolving conversation that is the true inheritance of our species. A Greek medical text could heal a patient in medieval Paris, but only if the monastery that owned it allowed access. The ancient networks we celebrate were not democratic forums. They were often exclusive enclaves, their doors open primarily to a privileged few urban elites, male scholars, and those sanctioned by religious or political power. A farmer in the countryside, a woman with a brilliant mind, an artisan with practical innovations, their voices and needs were largely absent from the grand libraries and translation houses. This was not a flaw in the system. It was often the system's design, a reflection of the societies that built it. The ethical question hanging over those marble halls was simple and profound: who gets to be part of the conversation? That same question echoes now in our digital age, defining the most urgent battles over the future of knowledge itself. Consider the modern fight for open access publishing. For decades, vital scientific research has been locked behind paywalls in expensive academic journals. A groundbreaking study on a tropical disease might be funded by public money, conducted by publicly employed researchers, and then published in a private journal that charges universities thousands of dollars for a subscription. This means a doctor in a low-income community or a student at a small college cannot read it. This is not a new problem. It is the ancient economic barrier of the parchment codex reborn in digital form. The scroll was chained to a desk in a monastery. The PDF is locked behind a corporate paywall. The open access movement, which pushes to make research freely available online, is a direct descendant of the monastic ideal that knowledge is a communal good, not a private commodity. It is an attempt to dismantle the economic gatekeeping that has always dictated who can learn and who cannot. Then there is the digital divide, a chasm as formidable as any mountain range that separated medieval libraries. The Internet promises a universal library, but that promise is meaningless without a device, a reliable connection, and the literacy to navigate it. A child in a remote village without broadband is as cut off from the global knowledge network as a medieval peasant was from the Library of Alexandria. This divide is not just about technology, it is about equity. It determines who can contribute to the global conversation, whose discoveries are amplified, and whose local wisdom remains isolated. The network is only as strong as its most neglected node. Perhaps the most profound modern reflection of this ancient tension is the movement to decolonize curricula. For centuries, the Western canon presented itself as the universal story of human achievement, but it was a canon built by the very networks we have traced, networks that filtered knowledge through the interests of empires and male, religious elites. The result was that vast swaths of human thought, from the philosophical traditions of Africa and the Americas to the scientific advances of the Islamic world and Asia, were marginalized, treated as footnotes to a European narrative. Decolonization is not about erasing Aristotle or Newton. It is about completing the library. It is the scholarly equivalent of sending agents to every dock, as the Ptolemies did, to gather every scroll, not just the ones that arrive on Greek ships. It seeks to restore the ghost networks to the main conversation, acknowledging that the mathematical genius of the Maya or the legal sophistication of the Mali Empire are not niche interests. They are essential chapters in the full story of human ingenuity. As we stand at the threshold of designing the next generation of knowledge networks, from quantum computing archives to global climate data collaborations, we have a responsibility to learn from antiquity's exclusions. The goal cannot simply be more information faster. The goal must be a system that is consciously, deliberately universal and equitable. This means building with access designed in, not added as an afterthought. It means valuing and preserving knowledge in all its languages and formats, from peer-reviewed papers to indigenous oral histories. It means creating structures that invite contribution from every corner of the globe, recognizing that the next great insight in medicine might come from a healer using traditional plants, and the next revolution in sustainable design might be inspired by an ancient building technique. The legacy of the ancient networks is not just a technical blueprint for moving data. It is a moral compass. It shows us the incredible power of connection and the profound cost of leaving people out. The future of human understanding depends on whether we can build a library without walls, a scriptorium without gates, and a conversation where every voice has the chance to be heard, preserved, and passed on. That resilient web is our shared inheritance. We have walked from the sunlit harbor of Alexandria, where scrolls were gathered from every ship, to the silent scriptorium where a monk's quill scratched by candlelight, and onward to the digital expanse where ideas now circle the globe in an instant. This entire journey maps a single, profound truth. Knowledge does not survive because it is locked away in a vault of stone or a server of silicon. It survives because it is given legs. It lives in the network, in the deliberate act of copying a text before the original molders, in the courageous work of translating an idea into a new language, and in the quiet conversation between two scholars separated by a continent or a century. The great libraries we remember were never final destinations. They were bustling crossroads, vital way stations where ideas paused, mingled, and were sent onward with new companions. They were the nodes, but the life was always in the connections. The philosopher George Santayana's famous warning rings through time that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But his insight contains a deeper, more hopeful layer we often overlook. The very possibility of remembering depends entirely on the networks that came before us. Without the scribe, the translator, the traveler, and the librarian, there would be no past to consult, only silence and forgetting. We are not condemned because we have, against all odds, been given the gift of memory, carefully passed hand to hand over thousands of years. This history is more than a record. It is an invitation and a responsibility. It asks you to see yourself as part of this unbroken chain. Your curiosity is the same force that drove a scholar in Baghdad to compare star charts. Your desire to understand and share what you learn continues the work of those Toledo translation teams. You curate your own library with every book you read, every documentary you watch, every meaningful conversation you have. You become a node. You can contribute to this network by seeking out diverse perspectives, by questioning what you find, and by adding your own voice to the conversation with clarity and respect. You protect it by valuing reliable sources, by supporting open access to information, and by recognizing that every idea that shapes our world once depended on someone choosing to pass it on. This story of survival is ultimately a story about human choice, about the decision to preserve, to share, and to connect. If this journey through the whispers of ancient libraries has sparked something in you, you are already holding the flame. Help us keep this conversation traveling forward. Subscribe for more explorations into the hidden architectures of history, and let us know in the comments below which guardian of the ancient network, the scribe, the translator, the traveler, or the librarian, resonates most with your own journey.